Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, most of you would have been here for 2 days, and by now you would have heard quite a bit on the issue of climate change, and I don't want to repeat what most of you would have heard. Forgive me if some of the things that I have to say today in this theme, looking at opportunities and challenges for developing countries in the context of climate change, if it were to stray into another area or some of the topics yesterday, because I was supposed to be here yesterday, couldn't make it, so I guess they stuck me in this session. But I think the last time we came here, a year ago, many of us were speaking about the loss of momentum since Copenhagen. We were worried that although we have had intervening conference of parties, that we did not have enough momentum to lead to the type of agreement that we need at the global level that would put us on a trajectory to save the world. And so most of us now, I'm sure, can look back over the year and say that there have been some changes that lead us to be a bit more optimistic that in 2015, we may be able to get an agreement that may not fulfill all the ambitions that we have, an agreement that may not be the one that is ideal, but an agreement of some sort. And what are these things that have happened over the years, over the past year? We had lamented that the United States of America was not taking enough of a lead. In 1 year, we have seen President Obama using the EPA under the Clean Power Plan to mandate a cut in their greenhouse gas emissions at a nationwide level. We have heard him give a speech in his Congress on the State of the Union address saying, this is the biggest threat, climate change is the biggest threat to the future of mankind. We've seen him go to China, the APEC meeting, and work out a deal with China, with pledges made to cut the US greenhouse gases emission by 28% by 2025. We've seen him go to Australia in the context of a very difficult situation there and pledge $3 billion to the GCF and say again that a deal is both possible and necessary in 2015. So, and then we've seen more recently President Obama come to India and focus again on the issue of climate change. We badly needed American leadership in the past. We have been critical of the Americans that they haven't done enough. President Obama is doing it. The jury is still out on how sustainable this will be because still doesn't have a Congress and a Republican Party that is very supportive of his efforts. But that leadership was vital. We spoke about China, and China has itself spoken about capping its emission by 2030. The European Union is speaking about cutting greenhouse gases by a minimum of 40% in the next decade or so. So we believe that the momentum that led to Copenhagen, that although Copenhagen itself was disappointing in its results, that momentum is building back towards Paris, that you have key elements and big players willing to step up and argue for an agreement. And that is the first signal that we needed. The second thing is Lima itself. Lima was successful in many regards by having a text ready, and I think it's a good stage from which to get to Paris. However, there are still things that we have to work on. We cannot become starry-eyed that this agreement will happen by itself. If we want the agreement to deliver the results that we all want, we have to now work on the building blocks. And sometimes in the declarative statements and in many of the speeches that proving the case over and over, the science of climate change and the necessity to do something and what countries declaratively are doing, that we lose sight of the building blocks, the heavy lifting that we need to do to get to a good agreement. So I believe that there are some elements we have to work on before before Paris. The first is the INDCs. This is positive. For the first time, all the countries in the world, which came out of Lima, countries will have to make commitments. They will have to explain those commitments. And for the developing world itself, many of these countries have not thought through the issue of climate change. And by preparing the INDCs, I think this is an opportunity to get them, many of the small countries that I have interacted with in the Caribbean, in Africa, and the other countries, to get policymakers for the first time to focus on the issue of climate change in a nationwide context. So they will have to decide what their levels of commitments would be, how they're going to achieve those commitments, what sectors those commitments are going to come from, how those will impact on national growth or welfare in the country. And I think that if the developing world, particularly the developing world, were to go through this exercise in the manner that it should be gone through, then they can set commitment levels which might be different from their ambition, and then argue that the difference between their commitments and their ambition has to be financed. So, positive outcome of preparing these indices would be forcing the countries to think through the issues first of all. I know the 14 countries of the Caribbean, none of them have gone through the climate issues in a way, in a manner that is required by the INDCs. They know what the impact anecdotally will be. They know that a hurricane can wipe out the equivalent of 60% of GDP or 75% of GDP in a overnight, but they have not thought through the issues detailedly. So I believe that if we were to do this and to get these commitments in very early, then we would, into the UNFCCC process, we would be establishing a baseline for help. The second issue is the whole issue of financing. And I think we all know now that Lima was short on financing. The developed world cannot think that it will get everyone to pledge, as we have all promised to do through the INDCs, and then walk away from the table not addressing the issue of financing. And $10 billion to the GCF is simply not adequate when you look at what is required to achieve the results we want. It is not adequate. So unless that issue is solved, Paris may get an agreement with a legal outcome. It may get an agreement with ambition, high ambitions even, although I'm doubtful about that. but it will not be an agreement that the developing countries will buy into if it doesn't include finance. And if anyone thinks that they're going to walk away from this issue, it's not going to, there would be no valid agreement or credible, legitimate agreement. So we need to stimulate a process even now to start talking about how we will raise $100 billion by 2020. A few years back, the UN Secretary General appointed a group, a high-level advisory group. I was part of that group with some others, and we did a report that showed that it was possible to raise $100 billion per annum. We looked at several issues, alternative financing, and that report is available. If there is political will, again, it comes back to the issue of political will, $100 billion can be raised easily per annum without it all coming from the treasuries of the developed world, because that is a big concern. They do not believe that public financing should be used in every case. So I would urge you to look at that report. But these are the two things that I think that are important. The INDCs and doing it early, and secondly, financing issue. If we can resolve some of these issues before Paris, I believe that the Paris Agreement will form the basis for changing the trajectory from this destructive one we're on. If it doesn't, even if it has a low ambition level, because we can use bilateral agreements, US-China bilateral, US-India bilateral, to raise the level of ambition beyond what is legally agreed there. But if it doesn't include financing, then there would be no credible agreement. It would simply not work. And so I just want to forewarn, because in the euphoria about the rebuilding of momentum to Paris, many countries and delegations believe they can just get away with a good agreement by making pledges. It's not going to be a good agreement. There has to be the issue of financing tackled. And the earlier we start working towards that, then, and looking at alternative sources, not just the treasuries of the developed countries, then the better the agreement with. It is propitious that I'm sharing the floor with a former Prime Minister of Norway, because we have used climate finance, an agreement with Norway on the forest, the sale of forest carbon, to catalyze in Guyana an entire series of low-carbon investments and to almost shift the trajectory of our development to a low-carbon trajectory. We set out to prove that there is a path to development that is not polluting, that you don't have to use the traditional polluting path to development, and that you can do so without compromising welfare. And so the funds garnered from the sale of forest carbon to Norway has been used, say, for example, to catalyze a big investment of about $850 million, most of it in private flows, to build a hydropower that has a tiny footprint, carbon footprint on the forest, but will supply over 90% of our power needs. We're using that to transform the economies of 165 villages where indigenous people live, so that they don't have to rely on cutting trees for welfare and for their prosperity. And that's the only way you'd save the forest, not by philanthropy or handout, but creating alternatives for people. We're using these funds to build a center for biodiversity studies so that we can export a new product, educational services, and a whole range of other things, adaptation, etc. So climate funds can present huge opportunities for developing countries in a new growth model, can help to catalyze change, But unfortunately, until now, a lot of those funds are not flowing in spite of the many charts you see and the graphs about disbursements. I chaired a committee that did a report for the Commonwealth Secretary General that I presented to the Commonwealth heads of government about climate financing for small countries. And there's a huge gap between perception and reality about how much money actually flows to these countries. And so I'm not going to get into that now, but if money flows to the countries through those are climate funds, but in a transparent manner, in a dedicated manner, it could help a lot of the developing countries address many, many of their concerns and even deal with resource management. I spoke with some Africans in FAO recently, and they said, we get advice piled on about how to manage our resources every single day. But if we don't have enough money to buy a vehicle for the forester to go out and to stop people cutting the trees, or to even buy a motorcycle for him to get out of the Forestry Commission, how are we going to manage the resources of the forest? They don't even have money in those agencies. So climate funds generally, coming back to the team, can be used for transformational purposes. They represent a huge opportunity for the developing world to grow and to create welfare, etc. But those have to be available. And currently, they're not available at the scale that is necessary. Thank you very much.